right, welcome back to What America's Thinking. We are discussing tight races in battleground states ahead of the midterm elections. Julia, you spent some time in Pennsylvania last week, so given the latest Emerson polling we discussed with Spencer recently, what do you make of the time you spent there and how things will shake out come election day?
Yeah, it was fascinating, Rafael, because we got to go from the eastern portion of the state to the western portion. So we started out in Luzerne County, which is the general area where Scranton and Wilkes-Barre is located. And then we made our way to Harrisburg for that highly anticipated next star debate between Oz and Fetterman. And then we went out to Somerset County towards Pittsburgh, got to talk with a number of rural voters out there, some dairy farmers, and then ended up in Pittsburgh. So we got a good mixture of suburban, rural, and urban voters. And I think from talking to voters, this is just to state the obvious, it's going to be close. Right. What was most fascinating was talking to voters the day after the debate. I talked to some voters who said the debate definitely made them more in favor of Fetterman, and then others who said the same thing about Oz. What was interesting about those voters, though, was they were so already leaning towards one direction, and the debate seemed to sort of confirm which way they were going to vote. So, that's just a small sample of the electorate, but it was fascinating to see how this debate that so many of us in the media were making a huge deal about was received by much of the population in Pennsylvania.
Right. I have family in Pennsylvania, and you always hear some version of Pennsylvania. You have Philadelphia, you have Pittsburgh, and you have, insert a southern state in the middle. Everybody tells it differently. It seems to be true, but that seems to also be sort of a reflection of the country as a whole, right? You have the coasts, east and west, and then in the middle you have the territory that votes more conservative in general. Did you get the feeling that this was already decided, that, we would have had pretty much the same result with or without campaigning?
I think there's some truth to that. However, I would say that Fetterman, more than maybe some other Democratic candidates, has spent quite a bit of time out in the rural communities. And so has gubernatorial candidate Josh Shapiro. But when I say other Democrats, but historically going back, John Fetterman in recent history has probably spent more time than other Democrats in those communities. And he was seen as a Democrat who could appeal to some of these blue collar voters, whether they're in urban areas or suburban areas or even rural areas. We weren't far from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, for example. He held a rally there about a week before we got there, and well over 300 people attended, which is a lot for that city and a lot for a Democratic candidate visiting that city in particular. And when we were in the rural areas, there were absolutely a lot of Doug Mastriano signs, a lot of Mehmet Oz signs, but in more of the cities and suburban areas, I would say we saw more Fetterman, Fetterman and Shapiro signs. And obviously, your yard signs, I know it's a bit of a cliche in political reporting, but it does kind of give you a sense of, what the general lean of the area is. So it was fascinating to see that. And I was able to talk to voters in Pennsylvania. Let's listen to some of those voter voices.
Spell your first and last name and what you do.
Sure. Robin Medeiros, Robin Medeiros. I am a hardworking Republican in Lackawanna County, but I'm also president of the Marjorie Scranton Republican Women's Council, and I am regional director for PFRW for the 4 counties. So Luzerne County is also mine.
Okay, so Robin, speaking of Luzerne County,
yes.
This is such a swing area. It arguably decided the 2016 election.
Yes.
Do you think that this area could once again swing, not only in the Pennsylvania 8th Congressional District, but also in the Senate?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think this is our time. People are hurting everywhere. The economy's hurting. They're just tired of the Democrats' rhetoric, and we need to get our Republican constituents in there, candidates in there. They just, they're tired of the cost of living. They're tired of crime going up. You can't go anywhere without being in an area where it has high crime anymore. So yes, I think we're going to take it this time.
Right. And what makes this district and Pennsylvania in general such a swing state? I mean, it's gone back and forth.
Yes. Well, it depends. When they get good and tired of what's going on, then they decide they're going to make a change. but Republicans are really going to sweep it this time. I think we're going to take control. And Pennsylvania really controls a lot of the country. So if we can pull this over the line and get these Republicans in here who are concerned about all the issues that Americans are concerned about, then I think we're going to be in good shape.
Right. And you mentioned, and these are the themes that were covered in there: inflation, crime, the situation at the southern border.
Yes.
Talking to Democrats, they bring up abortion quite a
Yes.
bit as an issue.
Yes.
Do you think that's a deciding factor for a lot of voters, or
No.
is it those other? And
No,
why?
because I think that issue was decided. It was decided years ago, and even if a state outlaws it, there's states next to them that will never do it. So if someone is for abortion, they're always going to find a place to go. And most candidates nowadays, they have, for certain instances, they're for abortion. So I think that's an issue that's long decided.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And in the Senate race between John Fetterman and Dr. Oz,
Yes.
it seems like that's really gotten super tight over the past couple of weeks.
Yeah.
What happened there? Why do you think Mehmet Oz has been able to close that gap?
Well, he's campaigning on the same issues that we're all concerned about. So he's out there working really, really hard. I don't think Fetterman's been out there as much. No, he's just a candidate that's just pushing for Americans for what they want. When you take our issues to Washington, we're happy, and we're not happy with the way that things have gone. So Oz is going to win. He absolutely, if you watch it, he has enough power to get over that line. And I think that even Democrats are going to vote for him. And in Pennsylvania, you have to have some Democrats vote. So I think we have that. I think he's done a great job. And I think he'll do a good job for us.
And you mentioned Democrats in Pennsylvania voting for Republicans.
Yes.
Do you think it goes back to that core message of inflation, border,
It is,
crime?
because it's just not Republicans that are hurting, it's everybody that's hurting. So he's going to pull in that vote.
Right.
So won't Jim Bognett. We need to pull in Democratic votes if we're going to win in Pennsylvania, and we've done that. From the calls I've made, and even people who are showing up at a rally next week, Democrats are coming.
Yeah.
So we're getting Democrats and Republicans to work together, and that makes all the difference.
Right. And finally, you mentioned you work with Republican women.
Yes.
You talk about the important role of women in Pennsylvania, women voters. It seems like the Philly suburbs, for example, Luzerne County, you see all this voter targeting of women in particular.
Well, and we're the ones who really get out there and help a lot, too. Not that men don't, but we're out there on the campaign trail working really hard. If you look at Carrie Del Rosso for lieutenant governor, she is nonstop. She never stops. She just keeps going. Same thing with Rosemary Brown up in our area, running for Senate. She just never stops. Women tend to just keep going. We're caregivers, we're caretakers. We just keep going, and we keep pushing. And we're pushing that red wave. We're going to get there, so.
Erin, do you have anything else? Wait. Well, Robin, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
taking the time. We appreciate it, and good luck to you.
Thank you.
So just to give some context on that, that was outside of an RNC event for the candidate Jim Bognett, who's challenging Matt Cartwright, one of the most vulnerable Democrats in the House. And that area, Luzerne County, you have a lot of locals, whether they're Republican or Democrat, who often talk about how it arguably played a key role in flipping Pennsylvania for Donald Trump in 2016. Obviously, in 2018, it swung back. So it's a bellwether county. And I think it'll be interesting to see, if there are ticket splitters in places like Luzerne County, and how a Bognett voter who would assumingly vote Republican up and down the ballot, how that would ultimately play. But at that event, Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee Chair Rick Scott was also in attendance. So it really shows how much infrastructure, how much the RNC and Republicans are pouring into this infrastructure.
So they believe it's as important. It is a bellwether state. Now, one thing that struck me about your interview there was she expressed a lot of confidence, of confidence that we've heard from Republicans from the get-go. It's hard to imagine sitting here in Washington how many Pennsylvania Democrats would take a liking to a character like Mehmet Oz, especially a candidate like Mehmet Oz. I can imagine a J.D. Vance in Ohio, for instance, even though he's been tied to the coastal elites and whatnot. But Oz is not an everyman the way Fetterman is, or J.D. Vance was, or Tim Ryan in Ohio is. Did you get the sense that she's right, that there are Democrats who are looking kindly upon Oz?
You know, I don't necessarily see that there are Democrats looking kindly upon Oz, but I think with the whole ticket in Pennsylvania, there could be some ticket splitting among Republicans in particular. You know, at these events I went to, sure, there were people in Doug Mastriano t-shirts or Doug Mastriano signs, but when you ask some of these officials and when you ask these voters, Republican voters, about Doug Mastriano, they don't have much to say about him. So it seems like if there's any ticket splitting going on, it's between Republicans not necessarily wanting to support Doug Mastriano and going towards Josh Shapiro, the Democratic Attorney General, as an alternative, or not voting at all for governor. So, you know, and I'm sure there's a minority of Democrats who would go for Oz, and I would say that compared to a Doug Mastriano, he's absolutely more mainstream. That being said, though, I think it's, in terms of the Senate, it's so divided already that I don't really see too much cross-voting there.
So that's an interesting thing. We've seen a few debates over this campaign where you can tell the candidates don't like each other. I think the Tim Ryan, J.D. Vance was the most obvious. We even might have mentioned that here. A character like Fetterman doesn't seem to be disliked as much by the right as would be, you know, name a coastal Democrat. Let's pick on
Nancy
AOC.
Pelosi.
Yeah, Nancy Pelosi, AOC. They're not the sort of the sample of the Democrat, you know, that from the right you're supposed to hate. What is it? So is it just in Pennsylvania? Was it just Fetterman's health issues that changed that race? Did they actually? Do you get the sense they actually found the formula to be Democrats and not seem like coastal elites or like Pelosi puppets?
Yeah. Look, I think Fetterman is an interesting character because, you know, they've definitely tried to paint him as someone who could be elite, who could be privileged, you know, talking about help he's gotten from his parents and, you know, how he's, you know, according to Republicans, they've sort of pushed out this narrative that he's relied on his parents, sort of an irresponsible figure. It hasn't really stuck because I think for a while, Democrats were hoping that John Fetterman was the anti-establishment figure, that he was someone who could appeal to Trump voters, potentially get to those voters who might have voted for Obama in 2008 and 2012, but swung to Trump in 2016. He's also someone who ran for Senate in the past, but was beaten down by the Democratic establishment. So he has that going for him coming into this race. You know, with the Nancy Pelosi and AOC and coastal Democrat thing, look, I think it's hard for someone like John Fetterman or Tim Ryan to have that same persona. You just can't in Pennsylvania and Ohio. And I think it's also notable that unlike AOC and Nancy Pelosi, they're both white men. So they have that going for them in that way with the lack of vitriol coming towards their way. So, you know, I think John Fetterman before the stroke was seen as sort of an ideal candidate for for a state like Pennsylvania. Now, look, I think Oz's campaign really got their act together after the primary, after they were really beaten down. We've seen them really improve their campaign and become very disciplined with their messaging. I think the same thing happened in Georgia. So we'll have to see what happens. But regardless, I think it's going to be 1 to 2 points.
It's going to be tight. It's going to be so. I mean, it's going to be tight in Pennsylvania. It's going to be tight in Georgia. It's going to be tight in Nevada. Did you, from talking to voters? I'm going to ask you the same thing I asked earlier. Do you see where our blind spot might be in analyzing this campaign, this year's campaign, from a purely political sort of policy lens?
You know, talking maybe a little bit. It seems like a lot of voters I spoke to in Pennsylvania, the price of food, the price of fuel going into winter, especially for a lot of the rural farmers we spoke with, that was of chief concern, and that seems to be kind of meshing with what we've heard. However, you know, it's true that there are a lot of Democratic-leaning voters who would say that abortion is a major priority for them, and you know, there are those of us in the media who would say that, you know, maybe maybe abortion, according to polling, isn't that big of a priority. But clearly, a lot of these Democratic campaigns, including Fetterman, see something there because they continue to message on abortion in addition to issues like the economy, like inflation, crime, that sort of a thing. But, I talked to another voter on the ground. Let's see what they had to say.
Harold Chalice, lifelong dairy farmer for 42 years, recently sold the cows and the farm. I've been involved in politics for literally decades because with agriculture, we've got less than 2% of the population involved in agriculture. And unless you're involved with the political parties, somebody else is going to tell you how to run your agricultural operations. And we know better than the general public what we need to do with farming.
Yeah.
We talk to the politicians, let them know what we need, work with them, support them where we can, and argue with them when we have to.
And why are you supporting John Fetterman and Democratic candidates this cycle?
As a lifelong Republican, I've always voted for the best person. John is that person. He's a person I can trust. He's a person who knows Pennsylvania. He's not moved here from another state and decided he's going to grace us with his presence. His a long history. Do I agree with everything he says? No. Probably 85, 90%, which is as good as I agree with my wife, so we're good. But that's the story. You've got to have somebody you can trust, somebody you know, somebody who has spent his life doing one thing and actually promising something else. You have to be careful with those people, and that's what the doctor is.
Right. And you mentioned that you also supported President Biden.
Yes.
2020, and we're in a very red area right now, seeing those Mastriano signs and such. What's it like, being a supporter of these Democratic figures in this area? And in general, do you see many people like you in this community?
In the agricultural community, there are few Democrats in Pennsylvania, but my philosophy, once again, is you vote for the best person. And the politics today have gone so far askew that the Republicans of 20 years ago are nowhere close to being the Republicans of today.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of Fetterman in particular, he's been paying quite a bit of attention to these rural areas. I know you said that he's been doing this for years now.
Yes.
Why do you think he's been able to draw these large crowds in these very ruby red rural areas?
Because he stands out of the crowd. He's not a politician, he's a big man. He dresses his own way, and that hoodie and shorts, that's his hallmark, but it works. He's a person you can trust. He tells you what he's going to do, and he does it. And we can't always say that with the other candidate.
Do you think Democrats, in the past have historically done a good job at appealing to rural voters, and what do you think they could be doing better?
I'm not sure either party has done a real good job of appealing to rural voters. They go wherever they can get the most votes the quickest. But that's been the philosophy there too.
Yeah, so Harold is, I would say, a minority in that area. We were in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, not terribly far from Johnstown, which I talked about earlier in the show. But when you drive down the road to his house, it's just Mastriano sign after Mastriano sign, very, very deep red. And we talked to some other voters down the street from Harold who weren't necessarily enthusiastic, vocal Republican supporters, but they were definitely in the camp for Oz. But Harold, a very interesting person, given that he's this lifelong Republican who supported Biden in 2020 and has kept his support for the Democratic candidate going into 2022.
So a few things struck me about Harold. First of all, the way the positive and negatives that have been painted about the candidates, the public personas of the two Senate candidates, the way they stuck with him, John Fetterman, the everyman, and the negatives on Oz, those stuck. I get a feeling like campaigns are being able to paint their opponents very well. They're having a little bit of trouble painting their own candidates. Mm-hmm. If you were, just as a thought exercise, if you were a campaign manager and you had to deal with either the negatives of Oz or the negatives of Fetterman in Pennsylvania, who would you rather be working for?
That's a good question. I could definitely see both sides.
Yeah.
I think Fetterman's campaign has been smart to attack Oz and paint him as an outsider, not in the positive political way, but an outsider in the sense that he does not have as many ties to Pennsylvania as, say, a Bob Casey does, or John Fetterman does, or a lot of other Democratic or Republican officials in Pennsylvania. He has more ties to New Jersey and has ties to Florida as well. He also can't connect with a lot of these voters in rural communities and urban communities the same way that maybe John Fetterman can, because he's been painted as an outsider as well, but not in a negative way, a political outsider, someone who can go to Washington and sort of shake things up. So that's definitely the perspective from the Democratic side.
The other thing that struck me about Harold is he gave you a data point that's really important. He said only 2% of America's voters are farmers, are actually in the agriculture industry. So when we talk about rural voters, we're not really talking about farmers, and that is huge. That affects the immigration debate, affects a ton of debates.
Absolutely, it does. And hearing that was so interesting because there's such a small portion of the electorate, oftentimes I think a lot of farmers feel that they're passed over. But at the same time, they're dealing with so many of the issues that, many of us deal with. We talked to one dairy farmer who lived right down the street from Harold, who was saying how concerned he was about the cost of fuel for his farm going into winter, and obviously in the highlands of Pennsylvania it gets pretty chilly up there. So that's an issue. Inflation, costs of goods, food, that all impacts them as well. So it was good to get that perspective that, even if you're in a rural community, you don't always get that agriculture perspective.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and thank you all for watching. And we got a pretty good peek into what America's thinking. We'll see you around next time.